You think you know yourself, that in the face of cruelty, you'd be the hero, not the villain. That if history repeated itself, you'd be the one hiding the innocent, not hunting them. But what if I told you that almost everyone who ever became a monster once believed the same thing? This is the Lucifer Effect, a disturbing psychological reality that shows how ordinary people just like you, can turn evil under the right, or perhaps more accurately, the wrong circumstances. Today, we're going on a journey most won't dare to take, because once you understand how easily darkness creeps into the minds of everyday people, you'll never look at your neighbors or yourself the same way again. But before we dive into this uncomfortable truth, take a moment to subscribe, not just for more content, but because here, we reveal the truths that others are too afraid to speak about. If you're brave enough to face them, you're exactly where you need to be to help you absorb every layer of this complex and chilling phenomenon. We've divided this video into 10 carefully constructed chapters. Each chapter explores one key piece of how good people, decent, moral, even loving individuals, can slowly be transformed into agents of cruelty and destruction. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Goodness. We all believe we are the heroes of our own stories. Ask anyone, your friends, your family, even strangers on the street, if they think they are a good person, and the overwhelming answer will be yes. They might admit to small flaws, like losing their temper now and then, or telling the occasional white lie. But deep down, almost everyone believes they're on the side of good. This belief is not just comforting, it's foundational. It allows people to sleep at night, to look in the mirror without flinching, to walk through the world with a sense of moral security. It is part of how we construct our identity. We are good, we are kind, we are fair. That's what we tell ourselves. But this belief is not only fragile, it's often false. The illusion of goodness is one of the most dangerous psychological traps that exist. It gives us the false confidence that we are immune to doing harm, that we're different from those who commit atrocities, that we would never do what they did, that we're better. This illusion blinds us. It makes us underestimate our susceptibility to power, pressure, fear, and conformity. It convinces us that evil is a foreign force, something that lives out there in dictators, criminals, and sociopaths. We imagine evil with sharp teeth and glowing eyes, easy to spot and easy to avoid. But real evil is quiet. It often begins with a shrug, a nod, a silent decision not to speak up, and most of the time, it begins inside people who believed they were good, just like you. Let's take a moment to ask the question most never ask themselves. Why do we assume we are good people? And more importantly, what happens when that assumption is wrong? The answer begins with how we form our moral identity. From a young age, we are taught right from wrong. Don't lie, don't steal, be kind, share, help others. These lessons become part of us. As we grow, we adopt rules, beliefs, and social norms that reinforce our self-image as decent human beings. We start comparing ourselves to others. I would never cheat like him. At least I'm not violent like her. Sure, I get angry, but I'd never do that. Every time we compare ourselves to someone who seems worse, our sense of goodness gets stronger. We don't realize we're standing on a shaky foundation, one built on judgment, not understanding, on confidence, not self-awareness, and yet, most people have never been truly tested. We don't know who we are under pressure. We've never been placed in a position of absolute power. We've never been isolated, afraid, or desperate. We haven't felt the pull of group conformity in a high-stakes moral dilemma. We haven't worn a mask and been told, no one will know. But some people have. History is full of ordinary individuals who turned cruel, not because they were born evil, but because their environment changed, and they changed with it. They weren't monsters in the beginning. They were neighbors, teachers, students, fathers, people who once held children, fed pets, laughed with friends. When the moment came, They didn't think, I'm about to become evil. They thought, I'm doing what I have to. I'm just following orders. Everyone else is doing it. This is normal now. And just like that, the illusion of goodness shattered and was replaced by something else. The need to justify, to survive, to belong, to obey. The terrifying truth is this: most people who do terrible things do not believe they are terrible people. In fact, they often believe they are doing the right thing. This is what makes evil so insidious. It hides behind good intentions. You might say, that's not me. I would never. But let's ask deeper questions. Have you ever stayed silent when someone said something cruel, just to avoid conflict? Have you ever laughed at a cruel joke in a group because everyone else was laughing? Have you ever followed instructions you didn't agree with because it was easier than speaking up? These may seem like small things, and maybe they are, but they are also warnings. Because every atrocity in human history began with small things, tiny decisions, minor compromises, and a voice inside that said, it's not that bad. The people who ran the gas chambers in Nazi Germany didn't start out as murderers. Many were bureaucrats, clerks, soldiers. They started by labeling, then separating, then transporting. By the time they were killing, they no longer felt like they were doing anything wrong. That's the power of moral drift. 1 degree off, over and over again, until you find yourself miles away from who you thought you were. The psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who coined the term the Lucifer Effect, argues that we must stop seeing evil as something created by bad apples. Instead, we must look at the barrel, the system, the conditions, the pressure, the roles we are asked to play. Because most people, given the wrong situation, are capable of shocking behavior. In other words, good people can, and do, turn evil, and they never see it coming. So, if we want to protect ourselves from this transformation, the first step is simple. We must stop believing we're immune. We must stop saying, I would never, because that sentence is the first lie. Instead, we must say, I could, and then ask, how do I make sure I don't? That's what this video is here to explore. We will not tell you that you're safe from corruption just because you feel moral. We will show you how morality is tested, stretched, and sometimes broken. We will look at the experiments, the case studies, the history, and the psychology behind every fall from grace. The illusion of goodness is comforting, but it is not protection. Understanding the truth is, and now that you've taken the first step, by facing the possibility that even the best among us are vulnerable, you're ready to move forward. Let's begin the real descent. In the next chapter, we will visit one of the most infamous psychological experiments ever conducted, a study so disturbing it had to be shut down in less than a week. A study that turned bright, kind, normal college students into abusers and victims, simply by changing their environment and giving them roles to play. Chapter 2. The Stanford Prison Experiment. It began in a basement, not a battlefield, not a courtroom, not a prison, just a hallway beneath Stanford University. Plain white walls, fluorescent lights, a few barred doors. But within days, it would become something else entirely, a psychological hell. This was the Stanford Prison Experiment, one of the most infamous studies in the history of psychology. It was designed to answer a simple question. What happens when good people are put in an evil place? And the answer? It shook the world. Let's go back to the beginning. The year was 1971. Philip Zimbardo, a psychology professor at Stanford, wanted to explore the effects of perceived power. Not real power, not military rank or political authority, but the illusion of power given by a simple role, prisoner or guard. He placed an ad in a local newspaper asking for volunteers for a psychological study on prison life. 75 people applied. After screening for psychological health, 24 college-aged men were selected. All were stable, intelligent, and average. They were randomly assigned to one of two groups. Half would be prisoners. the other half guards. That was the key. Random assignment. None of the participants had a history of violence, criminal behavior, or cruelty. They were, by all accounts, normal young men. On a quiet Sunday morning, the study began with a dose of reality. Without warning, the prisoners were arrested at their homes by actual police officers, handcuffed, searched, read their rights. They were taken to a real police station, fingerprinted, blindfolded, and eventually brought to the Stanford basement, now converted into a mock prison. Once there, their identities were stripped away. Their names were gone, replaced with numbers. They wore smocks instead of clothes, no underwear, rubber sandals instead of shoes. A chain was placed around one ankle as a constant reminder that they were inmates. The guards, on the other hand, were given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses to eliminate eye contact, and wooden batons. No specific rules were given on how to control the prisoners, just that they were in charge, and could not physically harm anyone, and that's all it took. The transformation began almost immediately. On the first day, things were calm. Everyone seemed to be playing along. But by the second day, the prisoners began to resist. They barricaded themselves inside their cells. They mocked the guards. They forgot, or perhaps remembered, that it was just an experiment. But the guards didn't respond with reason. They responded with dominance. They broke into the cells, forced the prisoners out, stripped them naked, removed their beds, and punished the ringleaders with solitary confinement. And then something darker began to unfold. The guards started escalating. They enforced arbitrary rules, forced prisoners to do endless push-ups, denied them the use of bathrooms, making them relieve themselves in buckets. They pitted prisoners against each other by rewarding obedient ones with privileges and punishing the rest. Even Zimbardo, the man who designed the experiment, became lost in his role. He acted as the prison superintendent, not as a scientist. When a prisoner wanted to leave, Zimbardo treated it like a security risk, not a psychological emergency. The line between experiment and reality had blurred, and then disappeared. One of the most disturbing moments came on day 4. A prisoner broke down emotionally, sobbing uncontrollably. He was released, but others were afraid to ask to leave, fearing consequences, fearing shame, fearing punishment. They had internalized their roles. The guards had too. What was supposed to be a 2-week study was shut down after only 6 days. Why? Because things had gotten too real. The guards had become sadistic. The prisoners had become submissive, depressed, and traumatized. No one had instructed anyone to act cruelly. No one told the prisoners to feel powerless. The transformation had happened naturally, driven by the power of the situation. Zimbardo himself later admitted he had underestimated the strength of the environment. He thought personality would be stronger than circumstance. He believed his volunteers were mentally strong enough to resist becoming tyrants or victims. He was wrong. The lesson of the Stanford prison experiment isn't just about a few students in a fake jail. It's about all of us. Because the roles we are assigned, the clothes we wear, the rules we follow, and the labels we accept, all of these things shape our behavior far more than we'd like to admit. Most of us believe we have fixed personalities, that we're good people regardless of what happens. But Zimbardo's experiment revealed something uncomfortable. It's not who you are that matters most. It's where you are, what role you're given, and what system you're placed in. Think about that. If you were randomly assigned to be a prison guard in this experiment, what would you have done? Would you have stood against the cruelty? Or would you have slowly, quietly joined in? It's easy to say we'd be the exception, but the evidence says otherwise. Over and over again, experiments have shown that the situation can be stronger than the individual, and when we combine power, anonymity, and a group dynamic, even the best people can do terrible things. But perhaps the most terrifying part of the Stanford prison experiment wasn't just how quickly people changed. It was how quickly they justified their behavior. The guards didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as maintaining order, enforcing rules, doing what was necessary. And that's how evil often works, not with rage, but with reason. No one wakes up and says, "Today, I will become a monster." They say, "I'm doing what has to be done. I'm following the system. This is what I've been told is right." The Stanford prison experiment was supposed to simulate prison life. But in the end, it exposed something much more profound: the fragility of morality, the terrifying power of context, and the ease with which ordinary people can become instruments of suffering when placed in positions of unchecked power. If these college students could turn into abusers in 6 days, what does that say about real prisons, real wars, real governments? What does it say about us? And what does it say about the illusion we cling to, that we are too good to ever do wrong? If we don't understand how the environment shapes us, we'll never know when it's shaping us for the worse. If we don't recognize the power of role, obedience, and group identity, we won't see when we're slipping. The truth is, there's a guard and a prisoner in all of us. Which one we become depends on where we're placed, who's watching, and what we're told is acceptable. But once you understand that, you can begin to resist it. You can start asking questions before giving orders. You can recognize when power begins to seduce you. You can stand up when others are staying silent. And that awareness, that ability to recognize the Lucifer effect in real time, that's what keeps you human. In the next chapter, we'll explore another iconic psychological study, this one not in a prison, but in a lab. A man in a white coat gives you instructions. A stranger on the other side of a wall screams in pain. You're told to keep going. Would you stop, or would you obey? Chapter 3. Obedience to Authority. A man in a white lab coat stands behind you. He looks calm, composed, professional. In front of you is a complex machine with dials, switches, and labels. One reads "slight shock," another says "danger," "severe shock." You're told the machine is part of a learning experiment. You sit down. Another man is strapped into a chair in the next room. You can't see him clearly, but you can hear him. He's supposed to memorize word pairs. If he gets them wrong, your job is to administer an electric shock. You begin with a mild zap. He gets the answer wrong. You increase the voltage. Another wrong answer. You increase again. Soon, he's screaming. You turn around. He's in pain. You say, "The man in the white coat responds calmly." The experiment requires that you continue. What do? This isn't a movie scene. It's real. It happened in the 1960s, and it became one of the most disturbing discoveries in psychology. The study was conducted by Stanley Milgram at Yale University, and it revealed just how ordinary people can become agents of harm when told to do so by authority. Milgram wanted to understand obedience, specifically, how far people would go in following orders, even if those orders meant hurting another person. The backdrop was World War II. Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, had just been captured and tried. His defense? He was simply following orders. Milgram's question was chilling in its simplicity. Could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices were just following orders? The experiment went like this. Volunteers, ordinary people from all walks of life, were told they were participating in a study on learning and memory. They were introduced to another participant, who was actually an actor, in on the experiment. The volunteer always played the role of the teacher. The actor played the learner. The learner was strapped to a chair in a separate room, and wired to the shock machine. The teacher, the real subject, sat at the machine and asked the learner questions. For each incorrect answer, the teacher was instructed to administer an electric shock, increasing the voltage with each mistake. The shocks weren't real, but the reactions were. The actor screamed, begged, pounded on the walls, even cried out about heart conditions. Eventually, the screaming stopped altogether, implying unconsciousness, or worse. Throughout it all, if the volunteer hesitated, the experimenter in the white coat would offer a series of prods. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must continue. The shocking result. Over 65% of participants went all the way to the highest voltage, 450 volts, even after the learner had stopped responding. They believed they were hurting, possibly killing another person. And yet, they continued. Why? Because someone in authority told them to. That's the terrifying truth Milgram uncovered. People are far more obedient than they think. Under pressure, in the presence of authority, our personal ethics can be overridden, not because we are evil, but because we've been taught to obey. Think about it. From childhood, we are conditioned to listen to those in charge: parents, teachers, bosses, police officers, doctors, soldiers. Authority is embedded in every institution we trust. And that trust can become blind. Milgram's subjects weren't sadists. They sweated. They trembled. Some laughed nervously. Many pleaded to stop. But when faced with firm, calm institutional authority, most continued. And afterward, many were horrified by what they'd done. Some cried. Some refused to believe they had been capable of such cruelty. Others tried to shift the blame. I was just doing what I was told. I didn't want to, but he said I had no choice. I thought someone else was responsible. Sound familiar? It should. These are the same justifications echoed through history, by guards, by soldiers, by interrogators. They rarely think they're making a moral choice. They believe they're following a chain of command. That's what makes this so dangerous. Milgram's experiment didn't just show that people follow orders. It revealed that the appearance of authority, just a lab coat and a serious tone, can override our deepest moral instincts. You might think you'd be different, that you'd stand up, shout, refuse. But so did they, and just like the volunteers. In Milgram's lab, most people underestimate the power of the situation. They overestimate their willpower. They believe that their conscience is stronger than social pressure. But psychology tells a different story. Milgram's findings have been repeated in different forms, in different countries, and even in modern times, with similar results. When people are placed in a structured environment with authoritative figures and a clear set of rules, obedience almost always wins. It's not just individuals who are tested. It's entire systems. In the military, in corporations, in politics, people are taught to follow, not to question, and that obedience can lead to atrocities. But the most terrifying part, the people obeying often still believe they are good. They don't feel like villains. They feel trapped, conflicted, confused, and in that confusion, they choose compliance over confrontation. Why? Because confrontation takes courage. Defying authority risks punishment, shame, rejection. It's easier, safer, to obey. And in that moment, evil doesn't need to roar. It just needs to whisper. It's not your fault. Just follow orders. Milgram's experiment holds up a mirror to humanity. Not the glamorous heroic image we want to see, but the fragile obedient creature we often become under pressure. So, how do we resist? It starts with awareness. Understanding that the instinct to obey is strong, that the urge to conform is powerful, that saying no can feel like rebellion, even when it's the right thing to do. It continues with preparation, knowing what to watch for, commands that go against your conscience, roles that feel wrong, systems that reward silence, recognizing that just following orders is not an excuse. It's a warning sign, and it ends with responsibility. Because no matter who gives the command, you are still the one who chooses to act. Obedience is not neutral. Compliance is not innocence. And silence is not safety. You are not powerless, but you are susceptible. And the more you accept that truth, the more you can defend against it. The Lucifer Effect lives in the space between who we think we are and who we become under pressure. It waits in the lab coat's shadow, in the chain of command, in the voice that says, you don't have a choice, but you always do. The question is, will you take it? In the next chapter, we explore how identity itself begins to erode when people are placed in masks, uniforms, or crowds. When you stop being you and start being part of something larger, something anonymous, what happens to your sense of morality? Chapter 4. The masks we wear. Deindividuation. Close your eyes and picture this. A person in a black mask stands in a crowd. Their face is hidden, their name unknown. Around them, hundreds more, masked, anonymous, chanting. Some begin to throw objects. Windows shatter. Fires are lit. The line between protest and chaos blurs. Now ask yourself, would that person have acted the same way if they were alone, unmasked, clearly visible? Probably not. This is the psychology of the process by which individuals lose their sense of personal identity and moral responsibility when they become part of a group, and it is one of the most powerful and dangerous forces in human behavior. We like to think that we make our own choices, that our actions are guided by personal values, ethics, and beliefs. But when we are submerged in a group, when we wear a uniform or a mask, when our names are replaced by numbers, and our voices blend into a chant, we change. We become less ourselves, and more a part of something else. In that shift, something vital is lost: accountability. This isn't just theory. It's been tested again and again. One of the earliest and most disturbing studies on deindividuation was conducted in 1970 by psychologist Philip Zimbardo, the same man behind the Stanford prison experiment. In the study, female participants were divided into two groups. One group wore name tags, their own clothes, and sat in well-lit rooms. The other wore hoods and identical robes, hiding their faces and identities. Both groups were asked to administer what they thought were electric shocks to a person in another room. The result: the women in the hooded anonymous group delivered shocks for twice as long as the women who were identifiable. They didn't hesitate. They didn't question when their identity was removed. Their inhibition was too. Zimbardo's conclusion was simple and terrifying. When people are deindividuated, when they feel anonymous, hidden, or part of a crowd, they are more likely to engage in aggressive, harmful, or immoral behavior. This explains so much of what we see in the real world: riots, lynch mobs, online hate, gang violence, even war crimes. People who would never act cruelly on their own suddenly find themselves capable of unthinkable acts when they're wearing a uniform, standing in a crowd, or hiding behind a username. The Nazi SS, the KKK, modern street gangs, terrorist cells, troll armies on social media. What do they all have in common? A loss of individuality, a shared identity that replaces the personal one, a new moral compass calibrated not by empathy or conscience, but by group norms, loyalty, and power. When you lose your name, your face, and your story, when you become just another mask in a sea of masks, you also lose the mirror that reflects your humanity. That's why masks have always held power in history. In tribal rituals, in warfare, in executions. A mask doesn't just hide the face, it hides the self. It says, I am no longer me, I am something else. And that something else can do things the person never would. This is the psychology that fuels crowds in a stadium, a political rally, or a protest that turns violent. People will often say afterward, I don't know what came over me. But the answer is simple. Deindividuation came over them. They weren't thinking, I'm about to break the law. They were thinking, everyone else is doing it. I won't be blamed. I'm just one of many. This sense of psychological invisibility is what makes the group so dangerous. It doesn't just make us forget our values. It replaces them. In the Stanford prison experiment, the guards wore mirrored sunglasses, not just to look intimidating, but to remove eye contact, to break human connection. The moment the eyes are hidden, something shifts. Empathy fades. Power grows. The same thing happens online, behind the screen. Under fake usernames, people say things they would never say in person. They insult, threaten, dehumanize. They feel untouchable. And when 1,000 others are doing the same, it no longer feels wrong. It feels normal. This is the digital mask, and it's just as powerful as a physical one. But it's not just about cruelty. Deindividuation can also make people more obedient, more passive, more likely to follow harmful orders. In groups, people hesitate less, question less, and surrender their moral judgment to someone else. Usually a leader, and that's the terrifying part. Deindividuation doesn't only lead to aggression, it also leads to obedience, even submission. In the military, this is by design. Uniforms, ranks, drills, chants, these are tools of identity stripping. They create loyalty to the group, not the self. And in war, that can mean the difference between hesitation and action. Between saving a life or taking one. When people feel like just a cog in a machine, they stop asking whether the machine is doing something good or evil. They simply turn. So how do we fight this? By reclaiming identity. By remembering our names, our faces, our personal values. By refusing to disappear into the crowd. It means taking responsibility, even when no one is watching. It means asking, would I still do this if I were alone? If my name were attached to it? If I had to explain it to someone I love? Because the mask is tempting. The crowd is comforting. The anonymity is seductive. But in the end, the consequences are real. We must never forget who we are. Even when everyone around us seems to have forgotten, we must hold on to the mirror, even when it's easier to put on the mask. Because evil doesn't always need hatred. Sometimes, it only needs us to stop seeing ourselves. In the next chapter, we'll look at how the pressure to belong, groupthink, can cause entire communities to justify, allow, or ignore horrifying actions. How can a whole town stay silent during injustice? How can families, co-workers, and even entire institutions participate in evil without question? Chapter 5. Groupthink and the Death of Conscience. Imagine sitting in a meeting room, 10 people around a table. A decision is being made, one you feel uneasy about. Something in your gut tells you it's wrong, but everyone else seems confident. No one is raising questions. The leader is firm. The team is nodding. Silence hangs heavy. You look around, unsure. No one else speaks up. So you stay quiet. 2 later, the consequences unfold. Damage is done. People are hurt. And you wonder, why didn't I say something? This is the silent death of conscience. It happens not with a scream, but with a shrug. Not with violence, but with agreement. This is groupthink, a psychological phenomenon where the desire for harmony within a group leads people to suppress their doubts, silence their objections, and ignore their instincts. It's more common and more dangerous than most people realize. We are social creatures. From birth, we are wired to belong, to be accepted, to fit in. It's how we survive. To be isolated, rejected, or cast out feels like a kind of death. So we learn to conform, to avoid conflict, to go with the flow. And in many cases, this instinct serves us well. It helps us cooperate, collaborate, coexist. But when the group is headed toward harm, this instinct becomes a weapon. It becomes the tool that silences dissent, crushes warning signs, and allows evil to grow. Quietly, collectively, without resistance. Groupthink is not about evil people making evil plans. It's about ordinary people ignoring red flags because the group seems confident, or because raising a concern would make them difficult, negative, or disloyal. In groupthink, protecting the group becomes more important than doing what's right. The classic example of this is the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a disastrous U.S. military operation in Cuba that failed miserably. Afterward, psychologists studied the decision-making process behind it. What they found was disturbing. Advisors knew the plan had serious flaws, but no one spoke up. They didn't want to challenge the president, or be seen as the odd one out. The result: a failed mission, international embarrassment, and unnecessary loss of life. But groupthink doesn't just happen in government. It happens in businesses, in schools, in churches, in families, in friend groups, even in online communities. Any place where people prioritize consensus over truth, image over honesty, loyalty over integrity. Groupthink begins to grow, and once it does, conscience begins to die. Because to follow your conscience, you have to be willing to stand alone, to be the only one in the room who says, "This is wrong," to risk being disliked, laughed at, even punished. But most people don't want that. They want to belong, to be part of the team, to stay safe in the warm cocoon of agreement. And so, they say nothing, even when their stomach twists, even when their heart knows better, even when the stakes are life and death. This is how groupthink enabled some of the greatest moral disasters in history. In the corporate world, it allowed companies to ignore safety warnings, cover up scandals, and deceive millions. In politics, it led to wars based on lies, genocides masked as national duty, and silence in the face of abuse. In religion, it enabled cover-ups, manipulation, and decades of hidden trauma. And in everyday life, it leads to bullying, racism, discrimination, injustice, all allowed to fester because no one in the group wants to rock the boat. Groupthink whispers, "Don't be dramatic. Don't make a scene. Just go along with it. It's not your place." And so, we obey, not because we're cruel, but because we're afraid. Afraid of isolation, afraid of being the outsider, afraid of standing alone. But here's the truth: every moral revolution, every act of courage, every stand against evil, begins with one person choosing to speak while others stay silent. One person willing to be uncomfortable. One person willing to say no. In a group infected with groupthink, the loudest voice doesn't have to be evil. It just has to be confident. That's enough to silence better instincts in others. That's why awareness is key. You must recognize the signs: when disagreement disappears, when doubts are dismissed, when people nod too quickly, when no one asks hard questions, when silence becomes agreement. That's when you know the group is not thinking, it's echoing. And if you're in that group, you have a choice. You can blend in, numb yourself, convince yourself it's not your responsibility, or you can be the person who remembers what it means to have a conscience, to listen to that quiet inner voice, to trust your sense of right and wrong, to believe that speaking up, even alone, is worth it. Because if you don't, if no one does, the group will do what it always does: follow the path of least resistance, even if that path leads straight into darkness. History has shown us where groupthink goes when unchecked. It goes to boardrooms that ignore whistleblowers, to regimes that erase voices of dissent, to bystanders who film violence but do nothing, to communities that protect predators because he's one of us, to institutions that bury truth to preserve image. And every time it happens, people later ask, how did this go so far? The answer is always the same: because no one spoke up. So speak, even if your voice shakes, even if you're the only one, even if they roll their eyes, whisper behind your back, or try to shut you down. Because when you do, you remind the group of something they've forgotten: that morality is not a popularity contest, that silence is not neutrality, it is complicity, and that every act of courage begins with one person remembering who they are. In the next chapter, we'll leave theory behind and look at what happens when all these forces — obedience, deindividuation, groupthink, are unleashed in a real-world setting, a prison, not in an experiment, but in wartime. We'll visit Abu Ghraib, where American soldiers, young, trained, and supposedly good, became perpetrators of abuse, humiliation, and torture. How did it happen? What made them cross the line? Chapter 6. Real-world horror. Abu Ghraib. Sometimes evil wears a mask, other times it wears a uniform. In 2003, inside the walls of a US-run prison on the outskirts of Baghdad, Iraq, a group of young American soldiers committed acts of abuse, humiliation, and degradation that shocked the world. The place was called Abu Ghraib. What happened there was not just a political scandal. It was a psychological tragedy, one that confirmed the darkest findings of every study we've discussed so far. It was the Lucifer Effect in full brutal motion. But the most disturbing part, the people involved were not monsters. They were soldiers, reservists. Some had worked in fast food before deployment. One had been a prison guard, another, a dental assistant. Most were under the age of 30. They had families, friends, pets, dreams. They also stripped prisoners naked, forced them into human pyramids, beat them, sexually humiliated them, and posed for smiling photos next to their suffering. The question everyone asked afterward was the same: how could they do this? And the answer, it's the same one echoed from the Stanford prison. Experiment to Milgram's lab, to every moment when good people turn evil. Let's understand the environment. Abu Ghraib wasn't just a prison. It was a pressure cooker. The prison housed thousands of Iraqis, many of whom were never formally charged or given due process. Some were innocent civilians, others were suspected insurgents. Information was chaotic. Fear was constant. Stress levels were unbearable. There were not enough staff. Training was minimal. Oversight was inconsistent. Soldiers worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, in a war zone where every Iraqi was a potential enemy. The chain of command was murky. Rules were unclear. Intelligence officers demanded results, especially information about terrorist networks. And in that confusion, a dangerous message was whispered, sometimes directly, sometimes through silence. Do whatever it takes. That's all it took. Guards began using tactics that escalated far beyond standard procedure. Detainees were blindfolded for hours, deprived of sleep, beaten, intimidated with dogs, stripped naked, stacked like objects, forced to simulate sexual acts, mocked, shamed, photographed the soldiers, laughed, smiled, pointed. They didn't just commit these acts, they documented them. That was the most chilling part. The photographs that emerged in early 2004 weren't taken by investigators or journalists. They were taken by the perpetrators themselves. Trophy shots, keepsakes, visual proof of power. Why would someone take a picture of something so obviously wrong? Because, in their eyes, it no longer felt wrong. That's what happens when obedience, groupthink, deindividuation, and institutional failure collide. The soldiers at Abu Ghraib were in a high-stress, poorly managed environment where prisoners were demonized, rules were blurred, and leadership looked the other way. There were no individual names, just numbers. No human connections, just uniforms and accusations. No guidance, just vague pressure to get intelligence by any means necessary. And like the Stanford guards, they began to internalize their roles. They stopped seeing prisoners as people. They started seeing them as the enemy, terrorists, animals. And when the enemy is dehumanized, anything becomes justifiable. What makes Abu Ghraib especially tragic is how easily it could have been prevented. There were officers who knew, reports were filed, warnings were given, but they were ignored, buried, or dismissed. Why? Because to investigate would be to admit wrongdoing. Because the group needed to appear united, competent, strong. Because silence was easier. And so, the abuse continued, until the photos leaked, When the images went public, the reaction was instant and furious. Politicians condemned the acts. Officials claimed it was an isolated incident. The soldiers involved were court-martialed, sentenced, and labeled as a few bad apples. But that explanation doesn't hold, because when psychologist Philip Zimbardo, yes, the very same, was asked to analyze the situation, he saw something else, not just bad apples, but a bad barrel. He saw a system that created the conditions for cruelty, a toxic environment, lack of oversight, blind obedience, demonization of the other, role confusion, and a failure to intervene. He saw the Lucifer Effect, and what he found matched everything his earlier experiments had predicted. Zimbardo even testified at the trial of one of the accused soldiers, Specialist Charles Grainer. He didn't excuse the behavior, but he explained it. He warned that if we didn't understand how systems shape individuals, we would keep punishing the symptoms while ignoring the cause. Grainer was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Others received sentences ranging from months to a few years. But the system, the culture, the leadership failures, almost untouched. That's the real danger. When we see evil, we rush to blame individuals. It's easier that way, simpler, cleaner. But if we want to stop it from happening again, we have to look deeper. We have to ask, what kind of environment allows this behavior? What kind of leadership ignores it? What kind of training fails to prevent it? And what kind of silence lets it grow? Because the people at Abu Ghraib didn't set out to become abusers. They fell, step by step, into a moral pit, just like the volunteers in Zimbardo's basement. And if we believe we're immune, that we could never, ever do such things, then we've already missed the lesson. The capacity for cruelty lives in all of us, but so does the capacity for resistance. It lives in the person who reports abuse, even when it's unpopular, in the officer who protects dignity, even under pressure, in the guard who refuses to humiliate, even when others laugh, in the human who still sees humanity in their enemy. That's where our hope lies, not in believing we are above evil, but in preparing ourselves to resist it when it comes dressed as duty. Abu Ghraib should not be forgotten. It should be studied, remembered, not just as a political failure, but as a human one, because the line between order and chaos, dignity and degradation, decency and destruction can be crossed in a moment, unless someone stands at the line and says, no. In the next chapter, we step back into history, not a war zone this time, but a quiet town, a normal street, a collection of ordinary men, men who, in 1940s Europe, were given a task: round up the Jews. They weren't Nazis. They weren't trained killers. They were middle-aged fathers, mailmen, factory workers. And yet, by the end, they had murdered thousands. How? Why? And what does it tell us about ourselves? Chapter 7. From Citizen to Executioner. They weren't monsters. They were butchers, bakers, office clerks, salesmen, middle-aged men from Hamburg, Germany. Most were in their 30s and 40s. Many had wives, children, modest jobs. Most had never fired a gun in their lives. But in the summer of 1942, they were sent to Poland as part of a unit called Reserve Police Battalion 101. Their orders were simple: round up Jews from villages, separate those fit for labor, and execute the rest. And they obeyed. Over the following months, these ordinary men became executioners. They shot women, children, the elderly. They dragged terrified families from their homes. They forced people to dig mass graves, and then filled them. Not because they were sadists, but because they were told to. Historian Christopher Browning chronicled this horrifying transformation in his book Ordinary Men. It is one of the most important and disturbing accounts of how good people turn evil. Not in theory, not in experiments, but in the real world. Let's look at what happened. When the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 first received their orders, their commander made a stunning offer. Anyone who didn't feel up to the task could step aside. No punishment, no shame, no consequences. And yet, out of the 500 men, only a dozen stepped forward. The rest went along. They rounded up families, drove them into forests, ordered them to lie face down in rows, and shot them in the back of the head. Why? Because someone in authority had told them to. Because the group had accepted the task. Because it was easier to obey than to resist. These weren't Nazi fanatics. They weren't ideological killers. They were ordinary men, placed in an extraordinary situation. And as the killings continued, something even more disturbing happened. It became routine. The men got used to it. They drank to dull the guilt. They laughed dark jokes to survive the horror. Some even began competing to see who could shoot faster, better, and the longer it went on, the harder it became to step out. Because now, there was a new pressure. Not just obedience to authority, but loyalty to the group. To refuse meant breaking ranks. To step away meant watching your friends do it without you. And so, many kept going. Not because they wanted to kill, but because they couldn't bear the shame of saying no. That is the true face of group-driven evil. It's not always born from hatred. Sometimes it's born from silence, weakness, and the desperate need to belong. The men of Battalion 101 were not unique. Across Nazi-occupied Europe, countless civilians participated in or enabled atrocities. Not as fanatics, but as neighbors, co-workers, followers. They filled out paperwork, pointed to hiding places, drove the trains. Each individual step felt small, manageable, explainable, but together, it became genocide. This is what makes the Holocaust not only a horror of ideology, but a horror of obedience, and it's what makes Browning's account so devastating. Because it shows that the line between citizen and killer is not always drawn by rage or ideology. It's often drawn by circumstance, pressure, and quiet surrender. And if you think this could never happen today, ask yourself, have you ever stayed silent when something felt wrong? Have you ever followed an order just to avoid conflict? Have you ever ignored injustice because speaking up felt risky? Now imagine those instincts, multiplied across a group, backed by uniforms, fueled by propaganda, framed as duty. That is how ordinary people become the machinery of horror. But there's another side to this story. There were people who refused. Some of the men in Battalion 101 asked to be transferred. A few deliberately aimed their guns away. A few deserted. A few hid Jews instead of hunting them. Their numbers were small, but their courage was immense, and they proved something vital, even in the darkest systems. Resistance is possible, not easy, not painless, but possible. And it almost always begins with one decision, to say, this is wrong. To act not as part of the group, but as a human being. So, what can we learn from these stories? That the greatest danger to society may not be the evil few, but the silent many. That atrocities rarely begin with violence. They begin with roles, with uniforms, with orders, with fear of standing out. And that the moment you believe, I could never do that, you've already lost sight of your vulnerability. Because what happened in Poland in 1942 wasn't a monster outbreak. It was a mirror. And if we're not careful, we'll look into that mirror again. In the next chapter, we'll shift to a critical idea, the banality of evil, a concept introduced by political theorist Hannah Arendt during the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust. She didn't see a monster in the courtroom. She saw something worse. A man without thought. A man who followed orders, filled out forms, and committed evil without emotion. A man who turned horror into routine. Chapter 8. The Banality of Evil. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a bureaucrat, balding, middle-aged, with wire-rimmed glasses, quiet, neat, polite. His name was Adolf Eichmann, in 1961. Eichmann stood trial in Jerusalem for crimes against humanity. He had helped organize the logistics of the Holocaust, coordinating the trains, the routes, the deportation schedules that sent millions of Jews to their deaths. And yet, when people saw him in court, they were shocked. He didn't rage. He didn't rant. He spoke softly, formally, respectfully. He claimed he never killed anyone personally. He said he had only followed orders. He said he was simply a functionary, doing his duty. And that's when political theorist Hannah Arendt, who attended the trial, wrote a phrase that would echo through history. The banality of evil. What did she mean? That Eichmann wasn't a sadist or a psychopath. He wasn't driven by hate. He didn't even seem particularly ideological. He was frightening, not because he was demonic, but because he was ordinary. He didn't feel like a villain. He didn't even feel responsible. He had followed the rules. He had worked within the system. He had climbed the career ladder. He had obeyed authority. He had submitted his paperwork on time. He had turned evil into a checklist, and that, Arendt realized, was more terrifying than any ranting fanatic, because when evil becomes banal, it no longer needs anger, hatred, or bloodlust. It needs only obedience, routine, and a failure to think. Eichmann's trial showed the world something it wasn't ready to admit, that mass murder could be organized, not by madmen, but by administrators, not by zealots, but by clerks, not in fits of rage, but in cold, methodical systems. Arendt watched, as Eichmann described, in detached terms, how he arranged transportation for Jews from all across Europe, how he coordinated timetables, how he efficiently ensured that trains reached the right camps on schedule. He spoke as if describing cargo. Not lives. He didn't seem to feel guilt, not because he was evil, but because he had never really thought about what he was doing. He had surrendered his moral responsibility to the system, and in doing so, he had stopped thinking. That was the real horror. Not active malice, but thoughtlessness. A complete refusal to reflect, to question, to feel. And Arendt warned the world, when people stop thinking for themselves, when they become cogs in a machine, guided only by structure, routine, and authority, they become capable of great evil without even realizing it. They don't see faces. They see files. They don't hear cries. They hear numbers. They don't feel guilt. They feel efficiency. This is the banality of evil. It's not what we see in movies. It doesn't look like a villain in the shadows. It looks like a manager doing his job. It looks like a soldier stamping a form. It looks like a polite man in a suit who never raised his voice, who never saw the camps, who never fired a gun, and who made genocide possible. It is easy to demonize evil when it looks like violence. It's harder when it looks like order. But that's exactly why we must understand it. Because this kind of evil is harder to detect. It hides behind desks, behind laws, behind systems. It wears a name badge. It sits in meetings. It smiles at coworkers. End. Yet, it destroys lives, quietly, mechanically, without emotion. The lesson here is chilling and crucial. Evil does not always require hatred. Sometimes, it only requires obedience and indifference. So how do we fight it? We begin by remembering that morality is not automatic. We must think, constantly. We must question, reflect, doubt, because the moment we stop thinking, when we let the system think for us, when we let procedure override conscience, we become vulnerable. Vulnerable to following orders without reflection. Vulnerable to using language that dehumanizes. Vulnerable to participating in systems that harm without ever lifting a weapon. Arendt didn't excuse Eichmann. She wanted justice. But she also wanted understanding. Because if Eichmann was a monster, we could sleep easier. But if he was human, ordinary, unremarkable, banal, then we all carry that same potential, and that realization, as painful as it is necessary, because it forces us to stay awake, to stay thoughtful, to stay human, The banality of evil teaches us that the most dangerous thing we can do is stop paying attention to our actions, our language, our roles, our systems, because when evil becomes normal, it no longer looks like evil, it looks like routine. In the next chapter, we'll ask the question that arises, after all this darkness, can we resist? Can people stand up, say no, defy the pressure, and remain moral when everyone around them slips into silence? We'll look at stories of those who did, who risked their lives to disobey orders, protect others, and resist dehumanization. Chapter 9. Resisting the Slide, Acts of Courage. We've seen how easy it is to fall, to obey, to conform, to become part of the machinery of harm. But history doesn't only offer darkness, it offers something else. Something just as real, just as human, resistance. There have always been those who said no, who refused to dehumanize, who broke ranks, disobeyed, and stood alone, even when the cost was high. They weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people, just like the ones who fell. But they made a different choice. Let's begin with one of the most iconic stories of resistance. Oskar Schindler, a German industrialist, a member of the Nazi Party, a man who at first profited from Jewish slave labor, but as the war dragged on, something changed. Schindler began to see the humanity of those around him. He bribed officials. He forged documents. He pretended his workers were essential to the war effort, when in truth, he was sheltering them from death by the end of the war. Schindler had spent his entire fortune saving more than 1,000 Jews from the gas chambers. And when asked why, he didn't offer ideology. He didn't claim heroism. He simply said, they were people. That's all it takes, sometimes to remember that other people are people. Then there's Sophie Scholl, a university student in Nazi Germany. With her brother Hans and a small group of friends, Sophie began writing and distributing leaflets denouncing Hitler and the Nazi regime. They called themselves the White Rose. They knew the risk. They were young, brave, defiant. And in 1943, they were caught. Sophie was just 21 years old when she was executed, beheaded by guillotine. Her final words, "Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go. What does my death matter, if through us, thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" She didn't live long, but she died free. There's Stanislav Petrov, a name most people have never heard. In 1983, during the Cold War, Petrov was a Soviet officer on duty at a nuclear command center. Suddenly, the system alerted him. Multiple US missiles had been launched. Protocol required him to report it as an attack. If he had, it would have triggered a full-scale nuclear response. But something didn't feel right. The signals seemed too perfect, too few. He trusted his gut and reported it as a false alarm. He was right. The system had malfunctioned, and by disobeying orders, he may have saved the world. And then there are those whose names we'll never know. The Polish farmer who hid a Jewish family in his attic, the German officer who quietly destroyed orders for mass execution, the American soldier in Abu Ghraib who took the first photo, not of abuse, but of evidence, and reported it, the student who raised their hand in a classroom, the worker who said, "This feels wrong," the bystander who stepped between victim and aggressor. Resistance doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes, it looks like a whisper in a room full of silence. So what makes someone resist? Why do a few people choose the harder path when most go along? Psychologists have searched for answers, the key factors. Strong personal identity resistors often see themselves as individuals, not just group members. They are less swayed by peer pressure, moral clarity. They've thought deeply about right and wrong. They have internal values that don't change with the crowd. Empathy, they maintain their ability to feel for others, even enemies, even strangers. A sense of responsibility. They reject the idea that someone else will speak up. They feel they must. And here's the most important part. Courage is not born. It's practiced. People who resist often do so because they've made small moral choices before, saying no, asking hard questions, standing up for someone. When the big test comes, they're ready, not because they're fearless, but because they've built the muscle of integrity. That means resistance is not reserved for the heroic few. It's available to any of us too. But only if you're willing to feel discomfort, to be disliked, to risk isolation, because speaking up often comes with consequences. Schindler lost his fortune. Sophie lost her life. Petrov lost his career. But they kept something that cannot be taken, their humanity, and their stories live on. Not just as inspiration, but as instruction. They teach us that evil is not inevitable, that conformity is not destiny, that even when the tide flows strong, a single person swimming against it can change everything. So the next time you're in a room where everyone's nodding, pause. The next time you hear a joke that punches down, speak. The next time an order feels wrong, question. And the next time you feel alone in your conviction, remember, you are not. You stand with all those who have resisted before you, and you light the way for those who will resist after. In the final chapter, we'll bring everything together, the science, the stories, the warnings, the hope. We'll answer the question at the heart of the Lucifer Effect. How do we stop good people from turning evil? And more importantly, how do we stay good when the world around us begins to fall? Chapter 10. Becoming the Guardrail. Choosing good when evil is easy. We began this journey with a question. How do good people turn evil? And across each chapter, we saw how it happens, not in one dramatic moment, but in small, invisible steps. Through obedience, through masks, through silence, through systems that reward conformity and punish conscience, through fear, pressure, groupthink, thoughtlessness. We saw how the very structure of human psychology can be twisted to serve darkness. But now we ask the harder question. How do we stay good when evil is easy? Because that is the real challenge. Not understanding evil, but resisting it. And resisting it, not just in dramatic moments, but in daily choices. Small acts, quiet rooms, behind closed doors, when no one is watching. Because evil doesn't just rise in dictatorships and dungeons. It rises in board meetings, in hallways, in emails, in jokes, in silence. So, what do? How do we become guardrails? People who prevent the fall before it begins. The first step is to never let go of who you are. Evil often begins when we blur into roles, uniforms, groups, labels. Stay grounded in your identity, not your job title, not your team, but your values. Ask yourself often, who am I really? Not what are you, but who. Because if you don't know, someone else will define it for you. As Hannah Arendt warned, the greatest danger is not rage, it's thoughtlessness. When you stop thinking, you become whatever the system needs. So, question everything. Reflect constantly. Ask, why am I doing this? Who benefits? Who suffers? Keep your mind alive, even when it's easier to switch it off. There will be moments when everyone is nodding, and you know they're wrong. Stand anyway. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to speak while afraid. Practice this now. Speak up in small ways, so you're ready when it really matters. The fastest way to dehumanize is to stop feeling for others. Guard your empathy. Protect it, even when the person in front of you is labeled as other, enemy, lesser. Remember, they are you, living a different story. Dehumanization is the soil evil grows in. Empathy is the weed killer. We love to blame individuals. It's cleaner that way. But people behave according to the environment around them. If someone is doing harm, ask, what system allowed this, encouraged this, protected this? Don't just remove the bad apple. Clean the barrel. This knowledge is power, but only if it spreads. Talk to your children, your friends, your co-workers. Use your platform, whatever size it is. to share what you've learned, because the best time to build guardrails is before someone reaches the edge. We end here not with fear, but with responsibility. You now understand how evil seduces, how it disguises itself, how it hides in uniforms, in silence, in routines. But you also know how to stop it, how to resist, how to remember who you are. You can't change the world alone, but you can change the room you're in. You can be the voice that questions, the hand that interrupts, the mirror that reflects, the conscience that doesn't disappear. And if enough people do that, if enough people refuse, then the systems built to erode humanity will crumble. Then evil will not feel normal. It will feel unnatural again. So let's go back to the beginning. How do good people turn evil? One small step at a time. And how do they stay good? By refusing to take that first step. Or, if they have already taken it, by turning back. You can turn back. You can resist. You can be the guardrail. And in a world where cruelty is easy, choosing good is the most radical act there is. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful journey. If this video moved you, challenged you, or opened your eyes, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, speak about it, and most importantly, live by it. And if you want to go deeper into the hidden forces that shape human behavior, morality, and manipulation, don't forget to subscribe. Not just to this channel, but to the idea that we can do better, know better, and be better. This was the Lucifer Effect, how good people turn evil. Now, let's choose not to.